On a Sunday morning in May, a steel barrel emerged from the silt at Hemingway Harbor on the Nevada shoreline of Lake Mead. The water had been falling for months, and what had been lakebed for decades was now exposed mud, baking under a desert sun. Boaters docking at the harbor that morning spotted the barrel half submerged in the muck. When they looked closer, they saw fabric, a shirt, a belt, and then the unmistakable shape of human ribs. Inside the barrel was a man who had been murdered, shot once, sealed in steel, and dropped into the lake sometime in the mid-1970s or early 1980s. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police opened a homicide investigation. The FBI built a facial composite. The Clark County coroner extracted DNA, uploaded it to the national database, and waited. As of this writing, the victim has no name. But the lake that hid him for 40 years has a level, and that level has a number, and the number is 1,040 feet above sea level. It was a record low when the barrel surfaced. It isn't anymore. Lieutenant Ray Spencer, who led the initial investigation, told reporters he believed there was a very good chance the lake would give back more. He was careful with his language, the way investigators are when they know something the public doesn't yet. He didn't say the lake might return more bodies. He said the water level was dropping, and when it dropped, things that had been hidden would not stay hidden. He was right. Over the following weeks, Lake Mead returned 4 more sets of human remains. None of them have been identified. The lake is still falling. This is not a story about a murder. It's a story about a lake that was never supposed to empty, and the 40 million people who were promised it wouldn't. The barrel is simply the thing that made it impossible to ignore what the instruments had been saying for years. Something is broken in the plumbing of the American West, and it's not breaking slowly anymore. On July 12, 2026, the combined live storage of Lake Mead and Lake Powell fell to 12,675,509 acre-feet. That number broke the previous record low, set 3 years earlier in March of 2023. But the more alarming number is the date you have to go back to in order to find the last time the system held this little water. May 23, 1957. That's before Lake Powell began to fill. That's before the upstream reservoir even existed. The 2 largest human-made lakes in the United States, built half a century apart to store the flow of one river, are now holding less water together than the system held when there was only one of them, and it was empty. If you live in Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Tucson, San Diego, or any of 24 smaller cities downstream, a portion of the water that came out of your tap this morning began its journey in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, 1,500 river miles away. If you live in Denver, the same river feeds your supply, but from a different artery. The system serves 7 U.S. states. 30 federally recognized tribal nations hold rights to its water, many of them the most senior rights in the basin. Mexico receives a guaranteed allocation under a 1944 treaty. The river has been called the most litigated, most divided, most relied upon river in the world. It's also 450 miles shorter than it used to be. It no longer reaches the sea. The people who monitor this system for a living spent the summer of 2026 watching it fall at a rate no model had predicted. During the peak summer months, the reservoirs were losing 15,000 to 16,000 acre-feet per day. An acre-foot is the amount of water it takes to cover 1 acre of land to a depth of 1 foot. It's roughly 326,000 gallons, or enough to supply 2 average American households for a year. 16,000 acre-feet per day is 32,000 households every day for months. The people tasked with managing the system were not silent about this. On July 31, 2026, the United States Bureau of Reclamation, the agency that built the dams and has operated them for the better part of a century, released its final environmental impact statement for post-2026 operations. It's a 10-year framework. It runs through 2036. Buried in the document's technical language is a single operational parameter that rewrites a century of assumption. The framework allows for collective annual cuts of up to 3 million acre-feet for the 3 lower basin states: Arizona, California, and Nevada. 3 million acre-feet is not an adjustment, and it's not a drought measure. It's a recognition that the system as designed cannot deliver what it was built to deliver, and the people who built it are now the ones proposing to cut it by a fifth. The Interior Secretary at the time, Doug Burgum, released a statement the same day. It said the department has a responsibility to ensure the Colorado River system remains reliable and resilient for the millions of Americans, communities, and industries that depend on it. The statement was measured and confident. It was the kind of thing you say when you're standing in a burning building and you need people to believe the exits are clearly marked. Jack Schmidt directs the Center for Colorado River Studies at Utah State University. When the combined storage numbers were released in mid-July, he told reporters it was a teaching moment, a chance to communicate to the general public how dire the situation had become. He didn't say crisis, he said dire, and there's a difference. A crisis implies a sudden event. Dire implies a condition. And the condition he was describing had been developing for more than 2 decades, visible in every dataset, and largely ignored by everyone who wasn't paid to watch the numbers. Here is what those numbers were saying. In January of 2026, the 2 reservoirs were losing an average of 2,626 acre-feet per day. By February, that rate had jumped to 6,494. March saw 15,733. April hit 16,861. May dropped slightly to 11,001, likely due to late-season snowmelt reaching the system. June returned to 16,230, and in the first 13 days of July, the rate was 16,661 acre-feet per day. The curve was not linear, it was accelerating. Lake Powell, the upstream reservoir, stood at roughly 23% of capacity. Lake Mead, the downstream reservoir, stood at roughly 27%. Both reservoirs were designed to hold 2 years' worth of the river's average flow, a buffer meant to smooth out the wet years and the dry ones. But the average they were designed around no longer existed, and the buffer was gone. The system was running on what was coming in, and what was coming in wasn't enough. The river is 1,450 miles long. It starts in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, high in the Alpine, where snowmelt feeds a stream that grows into a torrent as it drops through the Rockies. By the time it reaches the desert, it's been joined by tributaries with names that belong to another century: the Green River, the Gunnison, the Dolores, the San Juan. It carves its way through sandstone and shale, through the geologic history of a continent, and then it hits the first dam, and then the second, and then a maze of canals, aqueducts, pipelines, pumping stations, and tunnels that move its water hundreds of miles away from its natural course. By the time the river reaches the California-Mexico border, it's often dry. In wet years, a trickle makes it to the delta. In most years, nothing does. This is not an accident. It's the result of a system designed in the 1920s to turn a desert into a garden, and it worked. Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the United States. Las Vegas exists because the river was tamed. The Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile canal, delivers river water to Tucson and Phoenix, cities that sit in basins where rain falls 8 inches a year. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California moves river water across deserts and over mountain ranges to serve 19 million people. Agriculture in California's Imperial Valley, some of the most productive farmland in the world, is entirely dependent on river water. The system feeds roughly 5.5 million acres of farmland across the basin. The economic output supported by the river is estimated at $1 trillion annually, and all of it rests on an assumption baked into the system at its inception. The assumption was that the river would deliver, on average, 16.5 million acre-feet of water per year. The assumption was wrong. The Colorado River Compact was signed on November 24, 1922, at the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was negotiated by representatives of the 7 basin states under the direction of Herbert Hoover, who was then Secretary of Commerce. The compact divided the river into 2 basins, Upper and Lower, and guaranteed each basin the right to beneficially use 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year. Another 1.5 million acre-feet was later allocated to Mexico under a separate treaty. The total allocation was 16.5 million acre-feet. The number came from stream flow measurements taken over a roughly 2-decade period in the early 1900s. It was the best data available at the time. It was also data from an unusually wet period. Tree ring studies conducted decades later, which reconstruct river flow by examining growth patterns in centuries-old trees, showed that the river's long-term average flow is closer to 14 to 15 million acre-feet per year. Some years are wetter, some are drier, but the average over 500 years is lower than the number the compact guaranteed. The system was designed to deliver more water than the river actually has, and the negotiators likely knew the number was contested. Historians who have studied the compact negotiations, including Eric Kuhn and John Fleck, have documented evidence that some of the delegates were aware the flow estimates were optimistic. But the compact was a political document, as much as a hydrological one. The upper basin states wanted protection from the faster-growing lower basin. The lower basin wanted certainty for the cities and farms it planned to build. Everyone wanted the deal done. So they used the number that made the deal possible, and they moved on. The river, for its part, had no vote. For most of the 20th century, the system worked well enough that the gap between promise and reality didn't matter. There were wet decades. The reservoirs filled. Lake Mead reached its peak capacity in 1983, during a flood year that sent water over the dam's spillways for the first time since the reservoir was filled. Lake Powell filled for the first time in 1980, 17 years after the dam's gates closed. For a generation, the lakes were full, the deliveries were met, and the structural deficit written into the compact was invisible. It stopped being invisible around the year 2000. Since the turn of the century, the Colorado River Basin has been in a sustained period of below-average flow. The term megadrought has been applied to it, a reference to century-scale dry periods identified in the paleoclimate record. But this one is different in a way that matters. The tree ring data shows that previous megadroughts were driven primarily by natural variability in precipitation. The current one is being amplified by rising temperatures. Warmer air holds more moisture, which means more water evaporates from the reservoirs before it can be used. Warmer winters mean more precipitation falls as rain instead of snow, and rain runs off immediately instead of being stored in the snowpack and released slowly through the spring and summer. The river's hydrology is changing in real time, and the system built to manage it was designed for a climate that no longer exists. Since 2000, the major cities that depend on the river have made dramatic progress in conservation. Per capita water use has dropped by 10 to 47% across the basin's urban areas, often outpacing population growth. Las Vegas, which gets 90% of its water from Lake Mead, has reduced its total consumption even as its population has grown. Turf removal programs, water recycling, and aggressive efficiency standards have wrung waste out of the system. But those gains have been offset by the fact that the river's supply has continued to shrink. The reservoir levels have continued to fall. And the largest user in the system is not the cities, it's agriculture. Roughly 70 to 80% of the Colorado River's water goes to farms. Much of that water grows low-value, water-intensive crops. Alfalfa and hay, used primarily for cattle feed, account for a significant portion of agricultural use. Some of that alfalfa is grown in the deserts of Arizona and California and then exported overseas. The economic logic of growing cattle feed in a desert and shipping it to China or Saudi Arabia has been questioned loudly for years. But the legal logic is clear. The farmers who grow that alfalfa hold some of the most senior water rights in the basin, and under the doctrine of prior appropriation, which governs water law in the West, senior rights are the last to be cut. The cities, which came later, are cut first. The 30 tribal nations in the basin hold a complicated position in this hierarchy. Many tribes were promised water rights in treaties signed in the 19th century, rights that were never quantified and often never delivered. In legal terms, many of these rights are among the most senior in the entire system, predating the compact itself. In practical terms, the tribes have historically received far less water than they are entitled to. Negotiations to quantify and deliver those rights have been slow, contentious, and incomplete. The tribes collectively hold rights to somewhere between 20 and 25% of the basin's total supply, roughly 2.9 to 3.2 million acre-feet. Much of that water has never been used because the infrastructure to deliver it was never built. As the system's shortfall has become undeniable, the political conversation has shifted. The question is no longer whether cuts are necessary. The question is who gets cut, and by how much, and who decides. The 10-year framework released in July of 2026 does not answer those questions. It sets a ceiling for cuts and leaves the details to be negotiated every 2 years. The framework is a placeholder, a way to move forward without consensus, because consensus has proven impossible. Every 2 years, the basin states are required to submit updated operating guidelines. Every 2 years, the negotiations collapse into the same arguments. The upper basin accuses the lower basin of using more than its share. The lower basin points out that the upper basin has never fully used its allocation, and under the compact, unused water flows downstream. The cities point to the farms point to their legal rights. The tribes point to the promises that were made and never kept. And the river, through all of this, continues to fall. 40 million people, 7 states, 30 nations, and one river that is shorter than it was, smaller than it was promised to be, and disappearing faster than anyone predicted it would. That is the map. And somewhere beneath it, buried in the silt where the water used to be, are the things the lake has been holding for us: a steel barrel, a body with no name, and the uncomfortable truth that the permanence we built our cities on was never permanent at all. The lake is still falling. The barrel was just the beginning. There is a second lake beneath Lake Mead. You cannot see it. It does not appear on any map of the reservoir. It is not measured by the sensors that track the elevation of the visible water, and it is disappearing faster than the lake everyone is watching. In 2025, a team of hydrologists led by Dr. J. Famiglietti at Arizona State University published findings that changed the conversation about the Colorado River Basin in a way that most people outside the field have not yet noticed. The study, authored primarily by Karim Abdelmohsen and published in Geophysical Research Letters, used data from NASA's GRACE and GRACE-FO satellite missions to measure changes in the basin's total water storage over 22 years, from 2002 to 2024. What they found was this: the basin lost 27.8 million acre-feet of groundwater during that period. That is roughly equal to the total storage capacity of Lake Mead at full pool. The entire visible lake, erased, underground. Groundwater is stored in the tiny spaces between grains of sand, in the cracks and pores of bedrock, in aquifers that stretch beneath the surface like invisible reservoirs. It does not evaporate. It does not reflect sunlight. It leaves no bathtub ring. When you pump it out, the only evidence is the fact that your well reaches deeper each year, or that the land above it subsides, or that a satellite passing overhead detects a shift in the planet's gravitational field because the mass of water that used to be there is gone. GRACE does not measure water directly. It measures gravity. The satellites fly in tandem, tracking the distance between them with extraordinary precision. When they pass over a region where the total mass has changed, the distance between them shifts by a few microns, and that shift is enough to calculate how much water has been lost or gained. Between 2002 and 2024, the signal from the Colorado River Basin was unambiguous. The ground was getting lighter. The water was leaving. 27.8 million acre-feet of groundwater, gone. And here is the detail that makes it worse. Groundwater is disappearing 2.4 times faster than surface water. The lake you can see, the one with the bathtub ring and the dead marinas and the steel barrel, is falling. The aquifer beneath it is collapsing. Dr. J. Famiglietti has spent most of his career studying water that people do not see. He was a senior water scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory before moving to Arizona State, and he has a way of talking about groundwater that makes it sound like a secret the planet has been keeping. Groundwater is disappearing 2.4 times faster than the surface water, he said in an interview following the study's publication. It's invisible, it's mysterious. The average citizen doesn't really understand it. The study broke the basin into regions and tracked the losses separately. The lower Colorado River Basin, which includes Arizona, California, and Nevada, lost 20.69 million acre-feet of groundwater. That is 71% of the region's total water storage decline. The upper basin, which includes Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, lost less, but it lost nonetheless. Across the entire system, when you add groundwater, surface water, snowpack, and soil moisture together, the basin lost 42.34 million acre-feet of total water storage in 22 years. The rate of loss is accelerating. In the first decade of the study period, from 2002 to 2014, groundwater depletion was significant but manageable. In the second decade, from 2015 to 2024, the rate tripled. The aquifer is not just shrinking, it is collapsing faster every year. By 2024, the basin was losing groundwater at a pace that exceeded the previous decade's rate by a factor of 3. Now here is the part that matters, and it is the part that will sound dry, and I am going to ask you not to skip it, because everything in the second half of this documentary depends on it. Groundwater and surface water are managed as two separate accounting systems. The Colorado River Compact does not mention groundwater. The law of the river does not regulate it. When the basin states negotiate water cuts, they negotiate cuts to surface water allocations. The water in the reservoirs, the water flowing through the river, the water delivered through the canals. Groundwater is not part of that negotiation. The legal framework that governs the basin does not count it in the allocations or the shortage declarations. It operates as though the aquifer does not exist. And yet, for decades, the basin has been using groundwater to subsidize the shortfall in surface water. When the river delivers less than expected, farms and cities drill deeper. When the reservoirs fall, the wells go down. The visible system and the invisible system are connected, hydrologically, but they are managed as if they are not. The river recharges the aquifer. The aquifer feeds the river. And when you drain one, you drain both. Dr. Familietti put it plainly in a follow-up interview. Everyone in the US should be worried about it, because we grow a lot of food in the Colorado River Basin. We're also supporting a number of data centers and computer chip manufacturers, and these are essential to our economy. He was not talking about the lake. He was talking about the water no one sees. The distinction matters because the lake's elevation, the number that gets reported in the news every month, the number that triggers the shortage declarations and the allocation cuts, measures only the visible water. It does not measure the aquifer. The groundwater is being pumped out faster than it is being replenished, and the entire system has been drawing on that reserve, quietly, for 2 decades, to keep the taps running when the river fell short. The elevation number that governs policy does not capture what is happening below ground. So when you hear that Lake Mead is at 27% capacity, that number is real, and it is alarming, and it is also incomplete. The lake beneath the lake is emptier, and it is emptying faster, and the accounting system that governs the basin does not see it at all. If the invisible reserve is collapsing faster than the lake everyone is watching, what does the lake's elevation actually measure? Is it a measure of the system's health? Or is it a distraction from the fact that the real collapse is happening underground, out of sight, in a reservoir that was never meant to be drained this way? Hold that question. We will come back to it. There is a second number that needs to be said out loud, and it has been in the room since 1922, and almost no one in authority has ever acknowledged it in a way that changed anything. The Colorado River Compact was negotiated in 1922 and signed on November 24th of that year at the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The negotiators were representatives from 7 states: Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. The commission was chaired by Herbert Hoover, who was then the U.S. Secretary of Commerce and would later become president. The compact divided the river into 2 basins, upper and lower, and allocated 7.5 million acre-feet of water annually to each. An additional 1 million acre-feet was allocated to the lower basin, bringing the total allocation to 16.5 million acre-feet per year. That figure was based on stream gauge data from the early 20th century. Data that showed the river delivering roughly 15 to 16.5 million acre-feet annually. The negotiators believed they were working with reliable numbers. They were not. The decade during which the compact was negotiated was one of the wettest periods the region had seen in at least 500 years. Tree ring data, reconstructed decades later by paleoclimatologists, confirmed what the negotiators could not have known. They were dividing a river during an anomaly, not a baseline. The river's long-term average flow is closer to 12.5 million acre-feet per year. In some recent decades, it has delivered less than 10. 1 acre-foot is the volume of water required to cover 1 acre of land to a depth of 1 foot. It is 325,851 gallons. 7.5 million acre-feet is an incomprehensible amount of water, and the compact promised that much to each basin, every year in perpetuity. The river has never consistently delivered it. The compact was not a perfect document. It was a political compromise, negotiated under pressure, signed in haste, and built on assumptions that were already fragile. But it became the foundation of the law of the river, and everything that followed was built on top of it. Subsequent treaties, Supreme Court decrees, federal statutes, all of them rest on the allocations set in 1922. And those allocations assume a river that does not exist. Eugene C. LaRue, a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey, published a report in 1916 warning that full development of the Colorado River would lead to a shortage of approximately 3.8 million acre-feet annually. He used historical flow data, careful measurements, and conservative projections. His findings were presented to the negotiators. They were largely ignored. The compact was signed 6 years later, and it allocated more water than LaRue had warned the river could sustain. 6 of the 7 states ratified the compact within 2 years. Arizona refused. The state's leaders objected to the allocation formula, which they believed shortchanged Arizona in favor of California. Arizona did not ratify the compact until February 1944, 22 years after it was signed, and only after a protracted legal and political battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Native American tribes who had lived along the river for centuries, who had irrigated crops from its waters long before the first European settlers arrived, were not invited to the negotiation. They were not represented at the table. Their rights were not mentioned in the compact. The legal framework that governs the river today was written as if the tribes did not exist. The compact requires the upper basin to deliver 75 million acre-feet of water to the lower basin over any rolling 10-year period. That is an average of 7.5 million acre-feet per year, the amount promised in the original allocation. As the river's flow has declined and the reservoirs have dropped, that requirement has become increasingly difficult to meet. Lake Powell, the reservoir that stores upper basin water, is at 23% capacity. Lake Mead, which stores lower basin water, is at 27%. The upper basin is required to keep delivering water downstream, even as its own reservoir empties, because the compact says it must. The founding legal document of the American West allocated water that, in an average year, does not exist. The river was overestimated, the allocations were inflated, and the baseline was wrong. The structure built on that baseline has governed the basin for more than a century, and every subsequent agreement inherited the same flawed arithmetic. Since the year 2000, the basin has been in what hydrologists call a megadrought, a sustained period of below-average precipitation and river flow. Climate change has made it worse. Warmer temperatures increase evaporation from the reservoirs and reduce the amount of water stored in snowpack. The river's average annual flow since 2000 has been approximately 12.4 million acre-feet, an 18% deficit compared to the long-term average from 1906 to 2024. And that long-term average was already lower than the figure the compact was based on. The river delivers less water than it was promised to deliver. The states use more water than the river can provide. The tribes are owed water that was never quantified and often never delivered. The cities have reduced their consumption. The farms hold the senior rights. And the system, legally and hydrologically, is built on a number that was wrong from the beginning. Has anyone in authority ever said this out loud in a room where it could change anything? Has any negotiator, any secretary, any commissioner ever stood up and said plainly that the compact allocated water the river does not have, and that every allocation, every treaty, every decree that followed is built on a foundation that was flawed from the start? The answer is complicated. Scientists have said it. Hydrologists have published it. Researchers have presented the tree ring data, the flow reconstructions, the evidence that the compact overestimated the river's capacity. But the legal system does not operate on scientific consensus. It operates on precedent, on signed documents, on the allocations that were agreed to in 1922 and codified in law. Changing those allocations would require renegotiating the compact, and renegotiating the compact would require consensus among 7 states, 30 tribes, 2 countries, and 40 million people who depend on a river that is already failing them. So the allocations remain, the promises remain, and the river continues to shrink. Lake Mead, the reservoir created by Hoover Dam, last sat at full pool in 1983. Full pool is an elevation of 1,229 feet above sea level. It is the level at which the reservoir is completely full, the level at which water begins to spill over the dam's spillways, the level the engineers designed the system to reach and maintain. The lake has not been that full in 43 years. Most people alive in the basin today have never seen it that way. Hoover Dam was built between 1931 and 1936 during the Great Depression by thousands of workers who labored in the desert heat to pour concrete, divert the river, and create the largest reservoir in the United States. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1985. It is a monument to the belief that the West could be controlled, that the river could be tamed, that permanence could be engineered. And for decades, it worked. The dam generated power. The reservoir stored water. The system delivered. By 2015, Lake Mead was at roughly 40% capacity. The bathtub ring on the reservoir's walls had become a permanent feature of the landscape, a white band of mineral deposits marking the water levels of decades past. The lake was low enough that the intakes that fed Las Vegas, the pipes that drew water from the reservoir and sent it to the city, were at risk. If the lake fell much further, the intakes would be above the waterline and the taps would run dry. Las Vegas, which draws roughly 90% of its water from Lake Mead, made a decision. The Southern Nevada Water Authority, the agency responsible for the city's water supply, began construction on a third intake tunnel, a deep water intake designed to draw water from an elevation far below the existing intakes. The project cost $1.4 billion. It took 7 years to complete. The tunnel is approximately 15,000 feet long, nearly 3 miles. It was bored through bedrock beneath the lake using a custom-built tunnel boring machine capable of withstanding 17 bars of water pressure, twice the previous world record for such operations. The intake sits at an elevation of 875 feet above sea level, lower than the dead pool threshold, lower than the point at which water can flow through the dam by gravity. Dead pool is the elevation at which Hoover Dam can no longer release water downstream. It is 895 feet above sea level. Below that level, the dam's outlet works are above the waterline. Water can no longer flow through the turbines to generate power. Water can no longer be delivered to Arizona, California, or Mexico. The system, at that point, stops functioning in the way it was designed to. The third intake sits 20 feet below dead pool. It was engineered to keep Las Vegas supplied even if the lake falls below the point at which the dam itself can operate. The tunnel was completed in September 2015. A companion pumping station was added in 2020 to facilitate water extraction at critically low elevations. The system is now capable of drawing water from the lake at levels the original engineers never anticipated, never planned for, and presumably never believed would be necessary. The tunnel is insurance. It is also an admission. It represents a $1.4 billion acknowledgement that the lake is not coming back to the levels it once sat at, and that the system must be re-engineered to function in a state of permanent depletion. You do not build infrastructure like that for a temporary condition. Las Vegas built a tunnel to reach water at the bottom of a reservoir that was supposed to stay full. The tunnel was not built as a temporary measure. It was built as infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure you invest in when you believe the conditions it is designed for are not temporary. The Southern Nevada Water Authority did not publicly say that the lake would never recover, but they spent $1.4 billion to prepare for a future in which it did not. If Las Vegas built a billion-dollar tunnel to reach water at lower levels, did they believe the lake would recover, or did they know it would not? The tunnel does not answer that question, but it suggests one, and the suggestion is that the people responsible for keeping the taps running in a city of 2 million people, in a desert, on the edge of a failing reservoir, made a calculation. They looked at the projections. They looked at the reservoir. The river's trajectory was clear, and they built a tunnel to the bottom. As of July 2026, Lake Mead's elevation is 1,041 feet above sea level. That is 188 feet below full pool. It is 146 feet above Deadpool. The reservoir continues to drop. The reservoir continues to drop, and as it drops, it hands things back. Start at Hemingway Harbor, the same stretch of shoreline where the barrel came up in May of 2022. Walk the receded beach in any direction, and you are walking on lakebed that has been underwater for most of a century. The silt is fine and gray, and it holds a footprint the way wet cement does. There are shells in it from creatures that lived and died in dark water. There are bottle caps and fishing weights and the ordinary trash of 80 years of recreation. And there are older things that were placed under the surface when the surface was much higher, on the assumption that the surface would stay where it was. A landing craft came up in 2022. A Higgins boat, the kind of small, flat-nosed vessel that carried soldiers to beaches in the Second World War, built by the tens of thousands, most of them scrapped or sunk decades ago. This one had a stranger history. It was used after the war to survey the Colorado River, and then it was sold to the Lake Mead Marina. And then, at some point that nobody wrote down carefully enough, it sank. For years it sat on the bottom, at a depth of roughly 185 feet, dark and cold and forgotten. The lake fell and the boat rose, not because it lifted, but because the water around it left. By 2022, the top of the hull was breaking the surface. Divers went down and photographed it. Historians came out to look at it. A boat built to carry men to a war in Europe, resting on the mud of a reservoir in the Nevada desert, visible again for the first time in the memory of anyone who worked the marina. That was not the strangest thing the lake returned. There is a town under the water. Or, there was. Its name is St. Thomas, and it was founded in 1865 by Mormon settlers who thought they were still inside the boundary of the Utah Territory. They were not, and eventually they would be in the reservoir. The town sat at the confluence of the Muddy and Virgin Rivers, in a stretch of bottomland that was fertile because it flooded. The people who lived there grew cantaloupe and asparagus. There was a school and a post office and an ice cream parlor and a garage. There was a church. For decades it was an ordinary small town, several hundred people at its peak, the kind of place that appears on old maps and then disappears from newer ones. Hoover Dam changed the calculation. When construction was completed in 1935 and the reservoir began to fill, the government bought the town. The residents were told, in essence, that their homes were going to be at the bottom of a lake. Most of them left over the course of the following years. The last resident to leave was a man named Hugh Lord, who stayed in his house until the water was lapping at the doorway. On June 11, 1938, Hugh Lord got into a rowboat and rowed away from his home, which was by then partly submerged. Behind him, St. Thomas went under. For decades it stayed under. Sometimes, in dry years, foundations would poke up. In the drought of the early 2000s, more of it appeared. And now, in the sustained drawdown that has followed, most of the town is visible again. You can walk the streets. The stone foundations of the schoolhouse and the general store and the ice cream parlor are exposed to the sun. You can see where the sidewalks ran. You can find the concrete pad of the garage. There is a walking trail, maintained by the National Park Service, that lets visitors move through what used to be the town, at what used to be the bottom of the lake, at what used to be the surface of the ground. Not far from the town, the receding water has exposed something older still. Sections of a 19th century wagon road, the kind of route that carried settlers and mail and freight through this corner of the desert before there were railroads or highways or even reliable maps. The road is faint. It reads as a scar in the lakebed if you know how to look for it. It ran through country that was hard before the reservoir made it impossible, and now the country is coming back, in outline, in the shape it held before the water covered it. And there are the remains. The barrel at Hemingway Harbor was the first, discovered on May 1, 2022. 2 days later, on May 7th, a second set of skeletal remains was found at Colville Bay, several miles up the shoreline. Then more came through the summer, at Boulder Beach and Swim Beach. By the end of August, 5 sets of human remains had come out of the lake, and each of them had been placed there under the assumption that the water above them would be permanent. Lieutenant Ray Spencer of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department said what everyone working the shoreline was already thinking. "There is a very good chance," he said, "that as the water level drops, we are going to find additional human remains." He was correct. The additional remains have not, as of this writing, all been identified. Some of them may never be. The lake is returning them faster than the forensic system can process them. The pattern is what matters. Consider what a reservoir is in the mind of the person who uses it. A reservoir is a place where things go and do not come back. Water goes into it and stays there until it is drawn out through a pipe. Silt goes into it and settles. And for a certain kind of person with a certain kind of problem, other things go into it too. A body in a barrel, a boat that was easier to sink than to sell, a town that the government had already condemned, all of them placed in the lake because the lake was, functionally, a hole in the world. Whatever went into the hole was gone, except the hole is not a hole anymore. The hole is drying up, and the things that went in are coming out in something close to the reverse order of how they were placed. The most recent arrivals surface first, while the oldest come up last. The town of St. Thomas is at the bottom of the sequence because it was there before the reservoir existed, and the wagon road is beneath even that. The barrel from the late 1970s or early 1980s came up before the boat that sank sometime after the war. The reservoir is returning its inventory in the order it took them. Think of what the lake is. It has been operating since 1935 as an archive, a cold, dark, high-pressure filing cabinet of everything that entered it. Some of what it holds is deliberate. The dam itself was designed to store water and settle silt. Some of it is accidental. Boats that sank in storms. Fishermen who did not make it back. Some of it is criminal. And some of it is older than the archive itself, buried under the archive when the archive was built, waiting for the archive to fail. The archive is failing, not catastrophically, but slowly and systematically, in the order things were entered. Which raises a question you will hear echo through the rest of what follows. What is still down there? The lake covers roughly 247 square miles at full pool, less now, but still a vast, dark volume, most of which has not seen sunlight since Hoover Dam was completed. At the current rate of drop, more of that volume will be exposed each year, and what is exposed will not always be pleasant, and it will not always be identifiable, and it will not always have a family waiting for it. Lieutenant Spencer's phrase is the operative one. As the water level drops. There is no version of this in which the level rises back to what it was and the archive stays sealed. There is only the question of what comes out next, and when, and who is on the shoreline to see it. The lake is not the only archive on this river that was built without asking who else had claims to the ground beneath it. Return to Santa Fe, Bishop's Lodge, November 24, 1922. The room where the Colorado River Compact was signed contained representatives of 7 states and the federal government. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, chaired the negotiation. The document that emerged divided the flow of the river between an upper basin and a lower basin, and guaranteed to each 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year in perpetuity. The signatures on the page bound the states to a shared understanding of who owned what. It has governed the river for more than a century. 30 tribal nations, whose people had lived along the Colorado and its tributaries for roughly 10,000 years, were not in the room. Their signatures were not sought. Their claims were not tabulated. The compact contains a single brief clause acknowledging that the agreement should not be construed as affecting obligations of the United States to Indian tribes. That clause is one sentence long. It is the entire consideration given, on the page, to the people who had used the river the longest. The legal reality was more complicated than the compact suggested, though the compact's signers had reason to know it and chose not to write it in. 14 years before Santa Fe, in 1908, the Supreme Court had decided a case called Winters v. United States. It concerned the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana and the water of the Milk River, but its reasoning applied everywhere. When the federal government set aside land as a reservation for a tribe, the court held it also, implicitly, reserved enough water to make that reservation habitable, to make it a homeland. Those reserved rights dated to the establishment of the reservation, which meant, in most cases, that they were among the oldest water rights in the western United States, senior to almost anything, and certainly senior to the claims being negotiated at Bishop's Lodge. The negotiators at Santa Fe knew this. The doctrine had been on the books for a decade and a half. And they wrote the compact anyway, divided 7.5 million acre-feet to each basin, and left the tribal claims for a later that has still not fully arrived. Some of that later has arrived in pieces. 22 tribes in the basin have, over the course of a century of litigation and settlement, secured recognized rights to roughly 3.2 million acre-feet of water annually. That is somewhere between 20 and 26% of the basin's average supply. It is not a small share. It is, in principle, a very large one. In principle. 12 other tribal nations in the basin have claims that remain unresolved. Adjudication and settlement of those claims will, when they occur, increase the total water legally owed to tribes. Nobody knows by how much. Nobody in a position of authority is eager to find out, because there is no water available with which to satisfy the increase. The Navajo Nation sits at the center of this. It is the largest reservation in the United States by land area, roughly the size of West Virginia, and it spans parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. It sits directly over the Colorado River and its tributaries, and within living memory, within this decade, tens of thousands of Navajo households have not had running water in their homes. The figure most commonly cited is that somewhere between 30 and 40% of Navajo homes lack access to piped running water. That means indoor plumbing, in the sense that most Americans experience it, does not exist for those households. It means water for drinking and cooking and washing comes from a truck or a barrel or a hauled container. A Navajo resident is roughly 67 times more likely to live without indoor plumbing than the average American. The distance to a public water source, on much of the reservation, is measured not in blocks but in miles, sometimes 5 miles, sometimes 10, on unpaved roads, in old vehicles, carrying containers that leak. An estimate from 2011 put the cost of hauled water on the reservation at more than $13 per 100 gallons, which is many times what the same water costs, delivered by municipal pipe in the cities that draw from the same river. This is not ancient history. This is now people whose relatives were alive when the compact was signed and whose grandchildren in 2026 still drive a truck to fill barrels. The Navajo Nation has been in court over water for decades. In 2023, one of those cases reached the Supreme Court. It was called Arizona versus Navajo Nation, and it concerned whether the 1868 treaty that established the Navajo Reservation imposed an affirmative duty on the United States to secure water for the nation. The tribe argued that a reservation, promised as a permanent homeland, cannot be a homeland without water. The government argued that the treaty said no such thing in so many words. The court ruled 5-4 in favor of the government. The treaty, the majority held, did not require the United States to take affirmative steps. It required only that the government not actively deprive the tribe of water it already had a right to. The distinction is legal, and it is narrow, and for the households hauling barrels, it means the wait continues. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Reclamation is preparing to impose mandatory cuts. On July 31, 2026, it released the final environmental impact statement for the post-2026 operational guidelines. That is the document that will, in some form, tell the lower basin states how much less water they get. It is being finalized against a background of unresolved tribal claims, unresolved senior rights, and unresolved questions about who, exactly, is at the front of the line. Under the law of the river, seniority matters. The oldest rights get served first. If the Winters Doctrine holds, and if tribal claims are, as a matter of law, older than the compact, then, in a shrinking system, the tribes should be the last to be cut, not the first. In practice, in a century of administrative decisions and negotiated shortfalls, it has often worked the other way. The people whose claims were oldest have received the least. The compact did not simply miscount the water. It misidentified who the water belonged to. And the question of what happens when the cuts come, whose share is reduced and whose is preserved, is not just a hydrological question or a political question. It is a question about whether the treaties that establish the reservations, some of them signed in the 1860s, are treaties in the sense that the word usually implies. Treaties are supposed to bind. The Compact of 1922 was written as if they did not. Sit with the arithmetic for a moment. 7.5 million acre-feet promised to the upper basin, 7.5 million to the lower basin, 1.5 million owed to Mexico under the 1944 treaty, and, layered underneath all of it, a set of tribal claims that add up, in the recognized portion alone, to more than 3 million acre-feet, with more to come as the unresolved cases are settled. The total legally promised water, on paper, comes to roughly 19 or 20 million acre-feet in a river, whose long-term average delivers around 12.5. The river cannot pay everyone. It never could. The compact was written during the wettest stretch of 500 years, and even then the arithmetic only worked because a large group of legitimate claimants had been left off the ledger. Now the ledger is being reopened, but the water is not. There is a version of this story in which the arithmetic makes it feel small, as if the whole thing were only a matter of allocation, only a matter of drawings on paper, only a matter of who signs which document, and when. The river itself, on days when nobody is arguing about it, is not small. Drive north from Lake Mead, up into northern Arizona, and stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon. The rim sits at roughly 7,000 feet. The river, at the bottom, sits at roughly 2,400. That is more than a mile of vertical air between the observer and the water. The canyon is 277 miles long. In places, it is 18 miles wide from rim to rim. In places, it is a mile deep and change. It is the single most visited natural site in the United States, and it is, by consensus, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. The Colorado River carved it, though not by itself. The Colorado had help from tributaries and from the uplift of the Colorado Plateau, and from wind and freeze and thaw over spans of time that are, honestly, hard for a human mind to hold. But the river was the primary tool. Somewhere between 5 and 6 million years ago, the Colorado established the course it now runs through the canyon. Older drainage systems in the region date back further still, perhaps 17 million years, in configurations that hydrologists and geologists have been arguing about for 100 years and are still arguing about. The exact chronology is not settled, but the result is visible from any overlook on the rim. 277 miles of corridor, walls of red and orange and purple and gray stone, layered like the pages of a book that opens downward through time. At the rim, the rock is roughly 230 million years old. At the river, the rock is nearly 2 billion. To walk from the rim to the water, on the trails the National Park Service maintains, is to descend through geological ages the way one might descend through the floors of a library. Every step down is a step further back. The river runs through the oldest rock at the bottom. Theodore Roosevelt visited in 1903. He was there to make a case for protecting the canyon. Standing on the rim, he said what has been quoted 1,000 times since. "Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." He was, in the language of his time, arguing that the canyon was worth more as itself than as anything human hands could do to it. He was also arguing against a specific class of proposal. Some people wanted to dam it, others wanted to mine it, and still others wanted to run railroads through it. Roosevelt's argument won out, at least for the canyon proper. The canyon itself is a national park, and it has not been dammed. The river above it has, and the river below it has, and the river that emerges from the canyon and continues south toward the border, toward Mexico, toward the delta that once fed the Gulf of California, has been diminished by every dam and diversion it passes through. Here is what the delta looked like once. Before the dams, the Colorado River Delta covered nearly 2 million acres of wetlands where the river met the Gulf. It was one of the largest desert estuaries in the world. Aldo Leopold traveled through it in the 1920s and wrote about it as a green lagoon. It was full of birds and fish and jaguars. It was the terminus of a river that had, for millions of years, delivered its full flow to the sea. Here is what the delta looks like now. For most years since 1960, the Colorado River has not reached the Gulf of California. It runs dry somewhere in the Sonoran Desert, tens of miles short of the sea. The wetlands have collapsed by roughly 90%. The birds are mostly gone. The estuary is a memory that a small number of biologists are still trying to keep as more than a memory. There was, in 2014, a brief exception. Under Minute 319, a diplomatic instrument attached to the 1944 Water Treaty with Mexico, the United States and Mexico agreed to release a pulse of water from the Morelos Dam near the border. The pulse was 106,000 acre-feet, released over several weeks in the spring. It was designed to mimic, on a small scale, the seasonal flooding that had once defined the delta. For the first time in 16 years, the river reached the sea. People walked out into the water, where it met the Gulf, and photographed it. Biologists documented the response of the plants and the birds. It was a demonstration. It was not a restoration. When the pulse ended, the river went dry again. Consider what that means. The Colorado River spent 5 million years carving one of the great canyons of the world. It built a delta that supported an ecosystem the size of a small country, and in the span of a single human lifetime, from around 1930 to now, we have taken enough water out of it that it no longer reaches its own mouth. The most famous river in the American West does not complete its journey. The river carved the canyon by carrying water. The canyon exists because the river existed at a certain volume, sustained over a certain span of time. The dimensions of the canyon are a record of what the river used to be capable of: a mile deep, 18 miles wide, 277 miles long. All of that is the receipt for water that used to flow. If you want to know how much water the Colorado once carried, you can stand at the rim and look, and then you can drive down to Lake Mead and look at the bathtub ring, the pale band around the reservoir, high above the current waterline, where minerals from higher water levels stained the rock white. That ring, in some places, is more than 180 feet tall. It is a receipt, too. It is a record of what the reservoir used to be capable of in a stretch of decades that turned out to be wetter than the long run. The river built the canyon. The dam built the reservoir. The canyon is still there, but the reservoir is going away. And somewhere between the two, in the current of a river that is smaller than it used to be, in the ledger of a compact that promised more than the river ever delivered, and under the roofs of families that still drive a truck to fill a barrel, is the actual question of the 21st century in the American West. If the river did this much with 5 million years and all its water, what does it do now with the water that is left? That is the question the canyon asks. It is the question the delta answers, in the negative, every dry year. And it is the question the reservoir has been trying to answer in the language of falling water and returned inventories for the last quarter century. That question, in the real world, gets answered by a spreadsheet. Not by a poem about canyons, and not by a treaty signed in a lodge. By a spreadsheet kept by an irrigation district that says how many acre-feet went to which field, in which month, and at what price. If you want to know where the river actually goes, you follow the spreadsheet. So, follow it. Of every 100 gallons drawn from the Colorado River, roughly 79 go to a farm, 12 go to a city. The rest goes to industry, to power plants, to evaporation off the reservoir surface, to leaks in old canals, to the small share the river still owes the environment. 79 and 12. Remember those two numbers, because almost every argument about the river, in public, is an argument about the 12. Almost every solution, on the ground, has to come out of the 79. The single largest use of Colorado River water, by a wide margin, is the growing of feed for cattle. Alfalfa, grass hay. Sudan, grass. Not lettuce, not almonds, not the fruit crates in the produce aisle. Cow food. By reasonable estimates, cattle feed crops alone drink about 1/3 of the entire river, and that is more water than every city in the basin uses combined. It is more than double the urban total, and it goes into a plant that is cut, dried, baled, and fed to a dairy cow or a beef steer, sometimes on the same continent and sometimes not. The largest concentration of that alfalfa is in the Imperial Valley, in the southeast corner of California, a place that was more or less a dry lake bed 120 years ago and is now a checkerboard of green fields visible from space. The Imperial Irrigation District holds the single largest entitlement on the Colorado River. It exceeds the state of Nevada's entire allocation. It exceeds the city of Los Angeles' share. On paper, it is larger than the entire state of Arizona's share of the Central Arizona Project. One irrigation district, in one valley, with older water rights than most of the West, growing hay in a desert where the summer temperatures pass 115 degrees. And here is the price the farmer pays for that water. Roughly $20 per acre-foot. An acre-foot is enough water to cover an acre of land 1 foot deep. It is about 325,000 gallons. $20 for 325,000 gallons of water in a desert. That rate, in Imperial, has been essentially unchanged since 2011. A household in Phoenix or Los Angeles pays that same $20 for a few thousand gallons, sometimes less. The gap between what a city pays for a gallon of Colorado River water and what a farmer pays for the same gallon is not a rounding error. It is a factor of hundreds. That is not a scandal. It is a policy. The policy was designed, a century ago, to make farming possible in places where, without subsidized water, farming would be impossible. The policy worked. The desert grew hay. The hay fed cows. The cows produced milk and beef. An entire regional economy was built on top of cheap water in a dry place, and the cheap water was, in essence, a public investment in food production. That is the honest version. The uncomfortable version is that a policy designed 100 years ago is now the largest single lever on the survival of the reservoir, and nobody at the table wants to touch it, because pulling that lever means telling farmers whose grandfathers built the ditches that the ditches are going to carry less water now. Some of that hay stays in the country. It goes to dairies in California, to feedlots in Colorado. to horse pastures in Kentucky, and some of it does not. In a normal year, roughly 1 out of every 5 bales of alfalfa grown in the 7 western states leaves the country. The largest destinations are China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. The hay is compressed into dense blocks, loaded into shipping containers, driven to the ports at Long Beach and Oakland, and put on ships that cross the Pacific. Somewhere in the middle of the ocean, a container of hay grown with Colorado River water is passing a container of manufactured goods coming the other way. The Saudi story is the one that has captured the most attention, and it is worth telling honestly because the sensational version is not quite the true version, and the true version is somehow worse. A Saudi dairy company called Almarai, one of the largest in the world, has for years operated farms in the American Southwest, including nearly 1,800 acres in California's Palo Verde Valley on the Colorado River itself. The company grows alfalfa on that land and ships it home, where it feeds dairy cows in a country that banned the growing of alfalfa domestically because it was using up their groundwater. Saudi Arabia looked at its own aquifers, ran the numbers, and decided that growing hay at home was a bad idea. So it came here, bought land where the water was cheap and the rules were old, and now grows the hay that its own hydrologists told it not to grow. That is a real thing that is really happening. The scale is not enormous relative to the total river, and it is not the reason Lake Mead is falling. But it is the picture that sticks, because it makes the abstract concrete. Somewhere in the Palo Verde Valley, water from a river that 40 million Americans depend on is being pumped onto a field of hay that will be baled, shipped across an ocean, and eaten by a cow in a country that ran out of its own water 20 years ago. That is the market at work. Water in the American West is priced as if it were still 1935, and until that changes, the market will continue to move the water to whoever can pay $20 an acre-foot, whether that buyer is inside the country or outside it. Now push the frame out, because underneath the fields is the same story that is happening above them at the dam. Hoover Dam has 17 main turbines, 17 enormous machines hidden inside the concrete, turning as the reservoir pushes water through them on its way downstream. Those turbines have, historically, supplied electricity to something on the order of 1.33 million people, spread across Arizona, Nevada, and California. Los Angeles gets some. Southern Nevada gets some. Rural cooperatives in Arizona get some. Cheap, reliable, low-carbon power that has been running, more or less continuously, since 1936. The physics of a hydroelectric turbine is not complicated. Water falls from a high place to a low place. Along the way, it turns a wheel. The wheel turns a generator. The generator makes electricity. The amount of electricity you get in a given second depends on how much water is falling and how far it falls. If the reservoir is high, you have a tall column of water pressing down on the turbines, and each gallon that passes through delivers more energy than it would from a shorter column. If the reservoir is low, the column is shorter, and every gallon does less work. This is why the elevation of Lake Mead is not just a water supply number, it is also a power number. As of the middle of 2026, the surface of Lake Mead is closing in on an elevation of 1035 feet above sea level. Below that elevation, the engineers who run the dam begin to face a real problem. 12 of the 17 turbines are, in the operational projections, at risk of becoming inoperable, or nearly so, if the water drops much further. Some estimates put the reduction in generating capacity, if things keep going this way, at up to 40%. Other estimates, more pessimistic, run higher. The exact figure depends on which turbine, which flow rate, which downstream release schedule. But the direction is not in question. The dam that was built to power the desert is losing the ability to power the desert, because the desert is drinking the water that used to spin the wheels. Here is what that means, in the flat language of a utility bill. When Hoover Dam produces less power, the utilities that used to buy that power still have to serve their customers. They do not close for the day because the dam is short. They buy the missing megawatts on the open market. The open market, especially on a hot summer afternoon in the Southwest, is not cheap. Natural gas peaker plants come online. Prices rise. Somebody pays. The somebody is, at the end of the chain, the ratepayer. The retiree in Boulder City who has been on the same grid since the dam opened. The renter in North Las Vegas whose air conditioner is running at 4 in the afternoon in August. The small business in Kingman that runs coolers all summer. They pay for the missing water in the form of a higher electric bill, and most of them do not know that is what they are paying for. There is also a fight, quietly, over which reservoir gets protected. Lake Powell, upstream, and Lake Mead, downstream. The Bureau of Reclamation controls the releases from Glen Canyon Dam at the bottom of Lake Powell, which in turn feed Lake Mead. If you hold water back at Powell to protect its levels, you starve Mead. If you let water down to protect Mead, you drain Powell. This is not a hypothetical trade-off. It is a decision that has been made quarter by quarter for years. Federal officials have been criticized, sometimes publicly and sometimes bitterly, for holding water at Powell in a way that has, some argue, deepened the crisis at Mead. The phrase used more than once is management-induced, a crisis at the downstream dam that was, in part, made worse by the choices at the upstream dam. Both dams belong to the same agency. Both reservoirs are on the same river. The decision is a decision about which set of consequences the country can better bear, and it is being made by people whose names most Americans do not know. Now, the proposal. On the last day of July 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation released the framework we have already touched on, the 10-year plan that runs through 2036. Inside that framework is a mechanism to reduce lower basin deliveries by up to 3 million acre-feet a year. That is roughly the annual water use of the entire state of Arizona under its Colorado River entitlement, give or take. The Arizona Department of Water Resources ran that number against its own share and produced a figure that made every phone in Phoenix ring at once. Under one reading of the proposal, Arizona could see cuts amounting to as much as 77% of its annual allocation. The department called that figure, in public, unacceptable. That was not a rhetorical flourish. That was a state agency, on the record, telling the federal government that the math on the page could not be the math in practice. Because if you cut Arizona by 77%, you do not just turn off the taps in Phoenix. You empty the fields in Pinal County. You strand the Central Arizona Project, the enormous canal that carries river water 336 miles up and across the desert. You break the deal that brought 1 million people to the Sun Corridor. You do not do that on paper without doing it in kitchens and in tractor cabs and in the loan offices of small-town banks. So the 3 million acre-foot number is not really a water number. It is a farm policy number. It is a question about which farmer, in which valley, growing which crop, gets told next year that the ditch is dry. The physics of the river makes the cut inevitable. The politics of the cut, who absorbs it and who decides, is unresolved. And it is unresolved on purpose, because the moment somebody names the farmer, the moment somebody says the words Imperial Valley, alfalfa, $20 an acre-foot, cut by half, a lawsuit is filed, and a senator's phone rings, and the question stops being a water question and becomes a career question. That is where we are in the summer of 2026. A dam losing its power, a reservoir losing its water. a federal proposal that would cut a state by 3/4 if read literally. A field of hay in Palo Verde being loaded into a container bound for Riyadh. And a farmer, somewhere, waiting for the letter that tells him which of those futures he lives inside. Which, predictably, is the point at which a certain kind of story starts to attach itself to the river. The story goes something like this. The crisis is not real, or not as real as the officials say. The reservoir levels are being manipulated. The releases are being restricted deliberately to make the shortage look worse than it is. The purpose is to give a pretext for the federal government to seize control of Western water rights, to consolidate the 7 states and the tribes and the districts under a single federal authority, and to reallocate the water according to a plan that has nothing to do with drought and everything to do with power. In the harder versions, there are foreign investors involved, or Wall Street funds buying up farmland to corner the market on water, or a coordinated effort to break the agricultural West so that its land can be redirected to other uses. Choose your flavor. The core is the same. Somebody is doing this to us on purpose. Take that seriously for a minute. Not because it is right, but because dismissing it out of hand is the wrong move, and because there is, underneath it, a kernel of something real. The federal government does control the release schedules from Hoover and Glen Canyon. That is not a theory. The Bureau of Reclamation, an agency of the Department of the Interior, decides how much water leaves each dam each month. It sets the operating rules. It writes the accounting. It is the referee and, in a real sense, one of the players. When federal officials say publicly that a certain water level is a critical threshold, and then the operating rules are adjusted so that the level is defended in a way that affects one set of users more than another, the affected users are not paranoid to notice. They are paying attention. The gap between what agencies say in press releases and what the operating documents actually contain has, at times, been wide enough to fit a lawsuit inside. There is also a real accounting question, one that even sober policy experts have raised. Terry Goddard, the president of the Central Arizona Project, has publicly accused the Department of the Interior of what he called buying the lies of upper basin states about their obligations to send water downstream. That is not the language of a conspiracy theorist. That is the language of a former state attorney general who runs the largest single deliverer of Colorado River water in Arizona, saying on the record that the federal accounting is bending to political pressure from upstream. Whether he is right is a separate question. That he said it, in those words, is a fact. The disagreement between the basins about who owes what and who has taken what is not a fringe idea. It is the substance of the fight. So the kernel is real. Federal control is real. Political pressure on the accounting is real. Disagreement between the basins is real. The theory that grows out of that kernel is a different thing. The theory says the crisis itself is manufactured, and that is where it breaks. Follow the energy budget. Not electric power here, but the energy of the story itself. What would a manufactured crisis require? It would require the fabrication, or at least the coordinated distortion, of 20+ years of satellite data. NASA's Grace and Grace follow-on missions, orbiting the Earth in a pair, measuring tiny shifts in gravity to detect how much water is in the ground and on the surface underneath them. 2 decades of that data, cross-checked by independent scientists at universities around the world, showing the same downward trend in Colorado Basin water storage. All of that would have to be, in some sense, on the plan. It would require the falsification of tree ring records. The dendrochronological reconstructions that have extended the flow record of the Colorado River back roughly 1,800 years to around the year 130 of the Common Era are built from something on the order of 2,400 wood samples drawn from 11 western states, cross-dated by researchers who published their methods and shared their data. Those records identified, among other things, a 24-year megadrought in the medieval period that reduced flows by an estimated 32%, a drought considerably more severe than the current one, which has reduced flows by roughly 16%. Fabricating that record means fabricating the physics of tree growth in every stand of ancient pines from Utah to New Mexico. It would require the falsification of the water bills of 40 million households. Every irrigation district would have to cooperate. Every municipal utility. Every meter reader in 7 states. Every farmer who has watched his ditch run drier every summer for a decade would have to stay silent. Every rancher who has sold off cows because the pasture would not carry them. Every fishing guide on the San Juan and the Yampa who has watched his season shrink. Every tribal water manager who has been telling the government for a century that the promises were larger than the river. That is not a conspiracy that has a plausible energy budget. That is a conspiracy that would require the coordinated behavior of hundreds of thousands of people who have every reason to say the opposite of what the plan requires them to say. It fails not because it is too strange. It fails because it is not strange enough, and the number of witnesses it would have to silence is a number larger than the population of most Western cities. So the theory does not survive contact with the data, but the impulse behind it, the sense that the official story does not fully add up, is not a stupid impulse. It is pointed at the wrong target. Something in the official story does not add up, and that something is not a conspiracy. It is a disagreement, and the disagreement is happening between people who all have the same information, all have the same instruments, all have the same gauge records, and all disagree about what the numbers mean. That disagreement is the real argument, and it is happening not between officials and skeptics, but between scientists and scientists, in journals and at conferences, and in the pages of environmental impact statements that most Americans will never read. Consider 2 of them. Brad Udall, Senior Water and Climate Research Scientist at Colorado State University's Colorado Water Center. Engineering degree from Stanford, MBA from Colorado State. He comes from a family that has spent generations in Western water policy. His name is on some of the most influential papers of the last decade on the impact of warming temperatures on the Colorado River. In a widely cited paper with Jonathan Overpeck, Udall attributed roughly 1/3 of the 20% decline in Colorado River flows since 2000 to higher temperatures, independent of precipitation. Warming alone, he argued, was drying the river. That paper reframed the conversation. It moved the discussion from drought, which is a weather event, to aridification, which is a climate condition. His position, broadly, is that if the basin acts within this decade, if managed demand reductions are combined with efficiency improvements, and if the cuts are distributed with some intelligence, the system can be stabilized at a new, smaller equilibrium, a workable river, a river that can still deliver if the users are willing to take less. Jay Famiglietti, hydrologist, Director of Science for the Arizona Water Innovation Initiative at Arizona State University, formerly at UC Irvine in Texas. He is the researcher most closely associated with the GRACE satellite data, the 20-plus years of orbital measurement that has shown the basin bleeding groundwater at an accelerating rate. His numbers are the ones we walked through earlier. 27 and 8/10 of a million acre-feet of groundwater lost between 2003 and 2023, roughly the volume of a full Lake Mead, with the lower basin absorbing more than 70% of that loss, and the rate of loss more than tripling in the last decade of the record. Famiglietti's position, drawn from that data, is different. It is not that Udall is wrong about warming. It is that the picture Udall is working from is incomplete, because the surface record does not capture the invisible collapse underneath it. The basin, in Famiglietti's reading, has been running a simultaneous deficit above ground and below ground for so long that the gap between what the river can deliver and what the compact promises is structurally unclosable through conservation alone. You cannot efficiency your way out of a river that is permanently smaller than the one on the paper. The compact itself, in this reading, must be renegotiated downward, amended at its foundation, rewritten to match a smaller river. Both of these men have peer-reviewed publications. Both have read the same gauge records. Both are talking about the same reservoir and the same basin and the same 40 million people. And they are not saying the same thing. If you force the honest broker in this narration to say which way the evidence tilts right now toward familiarity. Udall is almost certainly right about the atmosphere. Warming is drying the river, and 1/3 of the 20% decline is a defensible number, and it is likely to grow. But the groundwater story is real, and the groundwater story is not in most of the plans. The 3 million acre-foot cut in the July framework is a surface water cut. It is written against reservoir elevations. It does not touch the aquifer. And if the aquifer keeps falling at 2.4 times the rate of the surface, at some point in the next 15 to 20 years, the aquifer runs into hard limits that the surface plans have not budgeted for. Pumps go dry. Wells collapse. Farms that were sold on the promise of groundwater as a backstop discover that the backstop is not there. That is the trend line extended, and it does not require speculation. Here is what would change that reading. If new measurements showed the groundwater loss slowing, not because of a wet year, but because of a real reduction in pumping. If the states passed groundwater management legislation with teeth in Arizona and California and beyond in the next few years. If the compact renegotiation, which is going to happen in some form no matter what, produced a framework that treated surface and groundwater as parts of the same account. If any of those happen, the tilt could move toward Udall's more optimistic reading. The tools exist. The people who understand the tools exist. What is missing is the political willingness to use them, and the willingness is missing because using them means telling somebody in the Imperial Valley or the Palo Verde or the Yuma area that the ditch is going to carry less. The disagreement is not going to resolve on this documentary's timeline. It may not resolve in this decade. What matters, for the listener trying to make sense of a river that keeps making the news, is that the fight is not between honest scientists and dishonest ones. It is between two honest readings of a hard data set. Udall is looking at the sky. Familiarity is looking at the ground. The sky is warming and the ground is emptying. And the question is, which one hits the limit first, and which one is more responsive to the levers we still have? If familiarity is right, every plan currently on the table, every framework in every press release out of the Department of the Interior, every 10-year cut schedule ever written for the lower basin, is a plan that will fail. The ledger they are balancing against is the wrong ledger, because it ignores half of the water budget. And the question then is not whether the plans fail. The question is only when. That is the tension the river is sitting inside as the summer of 2026 wears on. Two readings of the same water. One says we can steer. The other says we are already past the point where steering is enough. Both are working from the same gauges. Both have signed their names to the record. And somewhere, between the fields of hay in the Palo Verde Valley and the wheels inside Hoover Dam and the letter that has not yet been sent to the farmer whose ditch is next, the argument is being had, sentence by sentence, in language that most people who drink this water will never hear. The Bureau of Reclamation's July 31, 2026 framework was presented in the language of federal water policy as the moment the government finally forced the accounting to match reality. Up to 3 million acre-feet in annual reductions for the lower basin states, mandatory, not voluntary. A 10-year framework running through 2036. Secretary Burgum's statement called it a path toward sustainability. Arizona's Department of Water Resources called it devastating. The press called it the reckoning. And here is where the honest broker in this narration is going to tell you something uncomfortable. If the 3 million acre foot cut were implemented perfectly, and if every state complied, and if the efficiency gains held, and if the river's flow stabilized at its current reduced average, the system would return to a very specific condition. It would return to the 1922 allocation, the allocation written during the wettest decade in 5 centuries, the allocation that promised 16.5 million acre-feet from a river that delivers, on average, 12.5. The proposal does not fix the structural deficit. It narrows it. It buys time. And the thing inside that reassurance that is worse than the dread is this. The framework requires reassessment of operating conditions every 2 years. The next cut is already written into the baseline. So is the one after that. The 1922 compact is still the legal foundation. The numbers in that compact are still the numbers the courts enforce. And the compact itself has not yet been put on the table. So the question, and it is a real question, and it has not been answered publicly by anyone in a position of authority to answer it, is this. Who has the power to renegotiate the compact, and has anyone with that power said out loud that it needs to be done? The answer to the first part is Congress, or the 7 states acting unanimously, or a federal court under extreme conditions. The answer to the second part, as of the summer of 2026, is no. The framework proposes cuts. It proposes adaptive management. It proposes a 10-year horizon with biennial reviews. It does not propose changing the document that allocates 15 million acre-feet from a river that no longer carries 15 million. The reassurance is real, but it is not enough to close the gap. And the third echo of the question this documentary has been planting since the barrel surfaced is now complete. The thing that will break the system is the thing that has not yet been named. There is a second gauge that matters, and it has no public dashboard. Dead pool for Lake Mead is 895 feet above sea level. That is the elevation at which water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam or reach any downstream user by gravity. The reservoir becomes a plug. No hydroelectric generation for 3 states. No downstream flow to the agricultural users in the Imperial Valley or the fields around Yuma. No water at the intake for the Las Vegas Valley's 2 million residents, unless the third tunnel, the one completed in 2015 at a cost of $1.4 billion, can pull from an elevation the reservoir has never reached in the modern era. Dead pool is not a regulatory threshold. It is a physical one. Water does not flow uphill. When the lake reaches 895, the dam becomes a monument to a river that used to be there. As of mid-July 2026, Lake Mead sat at 1,041 feet. That is 146 feet above dead pool. And that sounds like margin. It is not. The lake fell 188 feet between 1983, the last time it was full, and the summer of 2026. 146 feet is 8 years at the depletion rate measured in July. Less if the rate accelerates. The Southern Nevada Water Authority built the third intake because the people who run the water system in Las Vegas looked at the trend line and concluded that dead pool was not a remote hypothetical. It was a condition they needed to engineer around, and the engineering cost more than $1 billion, and they built it anyway. But here is the part that does not show up on the elevation gauge. The 27.8 million acre-feet of groundwater lost between 2002 and 2024 is not coming back. Aquifer recharge in the Colorado River Basin is measured in centuries, not decades. The rate of natural replenishment under current climatic conditions is a small fraction of the rate of extraction. Farmers in Arizona are pumping water that fell as snow during the last ice age. That is not an exaggeration. Radiocarbon dating of deep aquifer water in parts of the basin has returned ages in the thousands of years. When that water is gone, it is gone on any human timescale. The monitoring instruments at Lake Mead measure the surface elevation with millimeter precision. They tell you, to the inch, how much water is in the visible lake. They cannot tell you how many growing seasons remain before the invisible reserve fails entirely. Famiglietti's line, and it is the line that stayed with this narrator longer than any other in the research, is this: groundwater is invisible, it is mysterious. The average citizen does not really understand it. And the invisibility is not metaphorical. The aquifer has no gauge at the visitor center. It has no boat ramp that moves farther from the shore every summer. It has no bathtub ring. You cannot see it from a satellite. The GRACE satellites that measured the basin's mass loss between 2002 and 2024 are no longer operational. The follow-on mission, GRACE-FO, launched in 2018, is still returning data, but the data require interpretation, correction for seasonal variation, and a level of technical literacy that does not translate easily into policy. What you can see is the lake. What you can measure is the elevation. And so the plans are written against the lake, and the aquifer keeps falling, and the thing that will end the system is the thing that has no public readout. The question, and it is open because reality has not closed it, is this: when does the accounting finally include the water that is not there? When does the framework stop treating groundwater as a reserve and start treating it as part of the same budget the compact was supposed to manage? Arizona passed groundwater legislation in 1980. It was stronger than anything in the West at the time. It is not strong enough now. The rate of depletion in the lower basin tripled after 2015. The legislation did not stop it. California has no statewide groundwater regulation of comparable scope. Nevada's groundwater use is a smaller fraction of the total, but it is rising. The compact does not regulate groundwater. The law of the river does not regulate groundwater. The July framework proposes cuts to surface diversions, and surface diversions are not where 2/3 of the loss is happening. So, the engine that guarantees recurrence is this: the system is designed to manage a visible lake, and the collapse is happening in an invisible one, and the instruments that drive policy are pointed at the wrong target. The blindness is structural, not a failure of knowledge. The people who understand the problem understand it completely. The tools to measure it exist. The science is published. What is missing is the mechanism to force the two accountings, the one for the surface and the one for the ground, into the same legal framework. Until that happens, every plan will treat half the water as if it does not exist. The river is being managed as if it were only the part you can see, and the part you cannot see is disappearing 2.4 times faster. Summer of 2026. Lake Mead Marina is still operating. The concrete ramps are longer than they were, and the parking lots are farther from the water, and the National Park Service has moved the courtesy docks 3 times in 4 years, but the boats are still launching. Las Vegas is still building. Drive down the strip at night, and the fountains are running at the Bellagio. The lights are on in 10,000 hotel rooms, and the construction cranes are up on 3 new towers on the north end. The Colorado River is still flowing through the Grand Canyon. Less of it. Warmer. The temperature of the river below Glen Canyon Dam has risen because the reservoir is lower, and the dam is drawing from a shallower, sun-warmed layer. The native fish that evolved in a cold desert river are struggling. But the river is there. The rapids are running. The rafts are on the water. And the lake did something in 2023 and 2024 that it had not done in years. It ticked upward. 2 consecutive winters of above-average snowpack in the Rockies. The inflow into Lake Powell was strong enough that releases into Lake Mead were higher than they had been since 2020. The combined storage, which had been falling every year since 2019, stabilized, then rose. The increase was modest, and it did not reverse the decade-long decline. But it was enough that headlines in the spring of 2024 declared the crisis easing. Enough that some of the farmers in the Imperial Valley, watching the elevation reports, allowed themselves to believe that the worst had passed. Then, July 2026 arrived. The depletion rate returned to 16,000 acre-feet per day. The combined storage of Lake Mead and Lake Powell fell to 12.67 million acre-feet, a level not seen since May 1957, before Lake Powell existed. The crisis had not eased. The river had granted a 2-year reprieve, and the reprieve was over. What 2023 and 24 demonstrated was variance, not recovery. A good year does not undo a structural deficit. It buys time, and the time it bought has now been spent. The people who live inside this system tonight are living inside a condition that has not yet resolved. There is a farmer in Yuma, Arizona, who has been irrigating lettuce with Colorado River water for 30 years. His grandfather did it before him. His water right is senior. It dates to 1901. He has not been cut yet. He knows he will be. The question is when, and by how much, and whether the farm survives it. He is 53 years old. He has a son who is 26, who went to school for agriculture, who wants the farm. And the father does not know, sitting at his kitchen table in the summer of 2026, whether to tell the son to stay or to leave. The water that made the farm possible was promised by a document written in 1922. The river that the document described does not exist anymore. The father knows that. The son knows that. What they do not know is who decides and when, which promises get kept and which ones get broken. There is a tribal water manager in Window Rock, Arizona, working for the Navajo Nation. She has been litigating for a quantified water allocation since 2008. The legal right, under Winters, is older than the compact. The Supreme Court ruled in 2023 that the federal government has no affirmative duty to deliver the water, but the right still exists. It is senior. It predates every farm in the Imperial Valley, and the infrastructure to deliver it has never been built. There are families on the reservation in the summer of 2026, hauling water in plastic tanks on the backs of pickup trucks, paying $13 per 100 gallons, while alfalfa is being grown 80 miles south with water that costs the farmer $20 per acre. Foot. She has been to 30 meetings in the last 2 years. She has sat across the table from Bureau of Reclamation officials and state water managers and representatives from the irrigation districts. She has heard every version of the same answer. There is not enough water. The math does not work. The compact is the compact. There is not enough water to honor every promise that was made, and somebody is going to take the cut. The people in the room with the longest history of being forced to take the cut are the people whose rights are the oldest. She knows how it is going to go. She has seen how it goes. And she is still in the meetings because leaving the room is not an option, and the alternative to fighting is accepting that the fight is lost before it starts. There is an engineer in Boulder City, Nevada, who works for the Southern Nevada Water Authority. His job is monitoring the intake system. The third intake, the deep tunnel, was completed in 2015. It can pull water from an elevation of 875 feet, 20 feet below dead pool. That intake is not active yet. The second intake is still operational. But the elevation of Lake Mead is dropping, and his job is to know, every day, how much margin is left, and when the switch has to be made, and what the pumping costs will be when the water is coming from that far down. The third intake was built because the people who planned the system in the 1930s did not imagine a condition where Lake Mead would fall below 900 feet for more than a brief period. It has been below 1,000 feet since July of 2022. It has been below 1,050 since April of 2021. The condition that was unimaginable in 1935 is the condition he is managing in 2026. He is 41 years old. He has 2 children. They live in Henderson. They drink water that comes from Lake Mead. And he knows, because the numbers are his job, that the intake he monitors was designed for a system that was supposed to be permanent. It is not permanent. The third tunnel is a contingency plan for a condition that is no longer contingent. It is the condition. And after the third tunnel, there is no fourth. The question that has not been answered, because reality has not answered it, is this. When the 1922 number is finally corrected to match the river that actually exists, who decides which 40 million people were promised water that was never there to give? The compact divided 15 million acre-feet. The river delivers, on average, 12.5. Someone is short by 2.5 million, and the compact does not say who. There is no priority system between the upper and lower basins. There is no mechanism for renegotiation. The compact includes a clause that says if the river cannot deliver 15 million acre-feet to the upper and lower basins combined, the upper basin is required to deliver 75 million acre-feet in any consecutive 10-year period to the lower basin. But the document is silent on what happens if the river cannot deliver 75 million in 10 years. Silent on what happens if the groundwater runs out. Silent on what happens if the lake reaches dead pool. It was written during the wettest decade in 5 centuries by negotiators who believed the river was larger than it is, and it has been in force for 104 years, and it is still the law. The documentary you have been listening to opened on a barrel that surfaced in May of 2022 when the lake fell low enough to return what it had been holding. The barrel held a body. The body was unidentified. 4 more sets of remains were recovered by August. Lieutenant Ray Spencer of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department said at the time that as the lake continued to fall, more would surface. He was right. The lake is still falling, and the remains are still surfacing. The archive is being returned in reverse order. What the lake is returning is not just the things it took. It is returning a record of what the system looked like when the lake was being filled, and what it cost, and who paid, and what they were promised in exchange. The river carved the Grand Canyon over 5 to 6 million years. The canyon is a receipt. It is proof of the volume that used to move through that channel, year after year, century after century, cutting downward 1 grain at a time. The canyon is 277 miles long. The drop from the rim to the river is 4,600 feet in some places. That is not the work of a small river. That is the work of a river that carried snowmelt from the Rockies and sediment from Utah, and the drainage of 63,000 square miles, and it carried that load without stop for longer than human beings have been on the continent. The river that exists now is not that river. The canyon is still there, but the river that carved it is gone. What remains is a managed system, a regulated flow, a budget stretched across 40 million people and 5.5 million acres of farmland and 30 tribal nations and 2 countries. The budget was written wrong. The people who wrote it did not lie. They worked with the best data they had. The data was from the wettest decade in 500 years. They did not know that. They could not have known that. But the number they wrote into the compact has governed every allocation, every contract, every ditch, every dam, every city plan, every farm, every promise for 104 years. And it describes a river that does not exist. The question is open, and it is going to stay open, because the answer is not scientific. The science is clear. The river is smaller than the compact says it is. The groundwater is disappearing faster than the surface. The reservoir system is in structural deficit. The tools to measure it exist. The data is published. The researchers have signed their names. What is missing is not knowledge. What is missing is the political willingness to take the knowledge and turn it into a decision that forces someone, somewhere, to use less. And the someone is not abstract. The someone is the farmer in Yuma, the alfalfa grower in the Palo Verde Valley, the tribe that has been waiting for 116 years, the city that built a third tunnel because it saw this coming, the person reading the meter in Boulder City, every person who turned on a tap this morning in Phoenix or San Diego or Las Vegas or Los Angeles and expected water to come out, because it always has. When the barrel surfaced in May of 2022, it surfaced because the lake had fallen low enough that the thing it had been holding was no longer underwater. The lake did not decide to return it. The lake simply fell, and the barrel was there, and the falling revealed it. What the lake is revealing now is not just the objects it took. It is revealing the floor, the point below which there is no more margin. And the floor is not 895 feet. The floor is the year when the aquifer goes dry, and the pumps pull air, and the fields that were supposed to have groundwater as a fallback discover that the fallback was never a reserve. It was a loan. And the loan is coming due. The Colorado River is still flowing tonight. The lights are still on in Las Vegas. The alfalfa is still growing in the Imperial Valley. The turbines at Hoover Dam are still spinning. 40 million people are still drinking from a system that was designed for a river that does not exist anymore, governed by a document that allocated water that was never there. And the question that nobody in a position to answer it has answered is this: when the correction finally happens, when the number is finally changed to match the river we have, not the river we were promised, who decides which of the 40 million were drinking someone else's share?